All right, let's get started. We're going to unpack some really high-precision radiation therapy techniques today. Stuff that's, pushing the envelope.
Absolutely. We're talking stereotactic radiosurgery, SRS, and stereotactic body radiation therapy, SBRT.
Exactly. And if you're a resident, maybe studying for boards, or honestly, if you're just interested in how physics really drives modern medicine forward, this discussion is definitely for you.
It really is, because these aren't just small tweaks to what we normally do. SRS and SBRT, they represent a pretty significant shift from standard conventionally fractionated radiotherapy.
So building on things like IMRT and VMAT, but taking the precision way, way up.
Precisely. Taking that precision, which was already high, and dialing it up to, well, an extreme level.
And that's where the physics becomes absolutely critical, right? It's not just knowing what they are, but how they work fundamentally.
You've got it. The need for specialized physics understanding is paramount here. We're dealing with extreme accuracy requirements and really significant dose escalation compared to conventional. So where should we start? Maybe the core principles.
Sounds perfect. What fundamentally defines SRS and SBRT? What makes them different at their core?
Okay, I think there are 4 key principles we really need to nail down. Things that set them apart from the standard radiation therapy playbook.
All right, lay them on us. What's principle number 1?
The first one, and maybe the most obvious difference, is high dose per fraction. With conventional treatment, you're typically giving, 1.8 gray, maybe 2 grays per day, spread out over 5, 6, 7 weeks sometimes.
Right. Small daily doses over a long time.
Exactly. With SRS and SBRT, we flip that script entirely. We're delivering huge, biologically really potent doses, but in just 1 to 5 fractions total.
1 to 5. Wow. So we're talking doses like...
Oh, it could be 5 gray, 10 gray, 20 gray, sometimes even higher per fraction, delivered in a single session or maybe just a handful. This massive dose delivered so quickly fundamentally changes the radiobiology.
Yeah, I can imagine. Less time for normal tissues to repair between fractions, for one thing.
That's a huge part of it. And that high dose per fraction directly leads into the second principle because the stakes become so much higher.
Okay, so what's principle number 2?
Extreme geometric precision. Because you're hitting the target with such a powerful dose, you absolutely cannot afford to miss. The goal is often targeting accuracy down to the sub-millimeter level.
Sub-millimeter, that's incredibly tight.
It is. Think about it. With a conventional 2 gray fraction, if you're off by, say, 2 or 3 millimeters, it's not ideal, but it's usually manageable within the overall treatment course. But if you're off by that same 2 or 3 millimeters when delivering a 20 gray SRS fraction...
Disaster. You could either severely overdose a nearby critical structure, like the spinal cord or optic nerve, or you could underdose a significant chunk of the tumor.
Exactly. It's completely non-negotiable, which means you need really advanced tools and techniques.
Like what specifically? What enables that kind of precision?
It comes down to a few key things working together. First, highly effective immobilization. You need to prevent patient movement as much as humanly possible. Second, very reliable localization methods, ways to know exactly where the target is, not just at the start, but ideally throughout the treatment fraction. And third, rigorous verification techniques, checks and balances to confirm everything is aligned correctly before the beam even turns on, and sometimes during the delivery itself.
Okay, so immobilization, localization, verification, all dialed up to 11.
Pretty much. And this need for precision, combined with the high dose, leads directly to the third principle, which is a big physics challenge.
Which is?
Rapid dose fall-off. You need to create incredibly steep dose gradients right at the edge of the target volume.
Why so steep?
Because when you deliver that massive dose to the target, the physics of radiation means dose inevitably spills outside the target boundary, scatter or penumbra. If that spilled dose, even if it's only, say, 50% or 30% of the target dose, hits a critical normal tissue right next door.
It could still be a devastatingly high dose because the target dose itself was so huge.
Precisely. If your target dose is 20 gray, even 5 gray spilling onto the optic nerve could be catastrophic. So you need the dose level to plummet, to drop off as sharply as physically possible the moment you move outside the intended target volume. We often talk about wanting a razor-sharp dose edge.
Okay, like building a dose cliff right at the target boundary.
That's a great analogy. A dose cliff, exactly. Yeah. And achieving that cliff is where a lot of the clever physics comes in, which we'll definitely get into.
Good. And the fourth principle, you said there were 4.
Yes, the fourth one ties all of this together. Small PTV margins. PTD being the planning target volume.
Right, the volume we actually treat, which includes the clinical target, plus a margin for uncertainties.
Correct. In conventional radiotherapy, because you have uncertainties in patient setup day-to-day, organ motion, etc., you typically add a margin around the clinical target volume, the CTV, to create the PTV. That margin might be, say, 5 millimeters, 10 millimeters, sometimes even more.
To make sure you hit the tumor, even if things shift a bit.
Exactly. But because SRS and SBRT rely on that extreme geometric precision we just talked about, the better immobilization, localization, and verification, you have much less uncertainty to account.
So you don't need as big a safety margin.
Precisely. You can shrink those PTV margins dramatically. Instead of 5 to 10 plus millimeters, we're often talking margins of just 1 to 5 millimeters for SRS SBRT.
A smaller PTV means?
Less normal, healthy tissue gets included in that high-dose treatment volume, which is absolutely crucial for safety when you're delivering such potent doses per fraction. You're conforming the high dose much more tightly to just the tumor itself.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So the 4 pillars, again, high dose per fraction, extreme geometric precision, rapid dose fall off, and consequently, small PTV margins.
You got it. Those are the defining characteristics.
Now, you mentioned achieving that rapid dose fall off, that steep gradient or dose cliff, is a major physics challenge. How do we actually engineer that? What are the physics tricks?
Right. It doesn't happen automatically. You need to employ specific strategies. There are several key methods that contribute, often working in synergy. The first one is fundamentally about geometry, using multiple beams or arcs.
More beams than typical IMRT even.
Often, yes. And critically, these are frequently non-coplanar beams, meaning they don't all just enter the patient from directions rotating around, say, the patient's waistline, like in a simple axial rotation. They come in from different angles above, below, oblique angles. Or instead of static beams, you might use multiple rotational arcs, again, often non-coplanar or covering large angular ranges.
And the point of using so many angles is?
The key is that all these beams or arcs are meticulously planned and aimed so that they intersect only at the target volume.
Like focusing light rays with a magnifying glass.
Exactly like that. It's a fantastic analogy. Each individual beam might deliver a relatively low dose as it enters the patient and travels through normal tissue. But where all those beams, maybe dozens or even hundreds in some systems, converge, that's where the dose adds up intensely.
So you concentrate the dose right where you want it at the target.
Precisely. You get this massive dose accumulation at the intersection point, while the entrance dose from any single beam path is spread out over a much larger surface area or volume of normal tissue, keeping the dose to those tissues relatively low. It's geometric dose painting on a sophisticated level.
Okay, multiple intersecting beams, often non-coplanar. What else contributes to the sharp edge?
Beam energy is surprisingly important. You might instinctively think higher energy is always better, right? More penetration.
Yeah, like 10 MV or 18 MV penetrates deeper than 6 MV.
True, it does. But for achieving the sharpest possible dose fall-off, the penumbra, at the target depth, intermediate energies like 6 mega electron volts, 6 MV, are often preferred, especially for the typical sizes and depths of SRS and SBRT targets.
Okay, that feels counterintuitive. Why would lower energy give a sharper edge?
It's about the secondary electrons. When the high-energy photons interact with tissue, they knock electrons loose, and these electrons deposit most of the dose. Now, higher-energy photons produce higher-energy secondary electrons.
Makes sense.
And these higher-energy electrons tend to travel further, and importantly, they scatter further laterally sideways away from the original photon path before they deposit their energy.
So they blur the edge of the beam more.
Exactly. That increased lateral electron scatter essentially blurs the dose distribution at the beam edge as it goes deeper into the tissue. It widens the penumbra. A 6 MV beam, while penetrating less overall, generates secondary electrons with a shorter range and less lateral travel. This results in a sharper, less fuzzy dose profile at the edge, especially at the depths relevant for many SRS SBRT targets.
So 6 MV is kind of a sweet spot, balancing enough penetration with minimizing that lateral electron scatter for a sharper penumbra.
That's a great way to put it. It often provides the best compromise for sharp dose gradients at typical clinical depths.
Fascinating. Okay, multiple beams, careful energy selection.
Yeah.
What's next for sharpening the dose?
The third method is about physical proximity. Collimation, close to the patient. This is pure geometry. The penumbra, the fuzziness at the edge of the beam, is partly caused by the fact that the radiation source in the Linick head isn't a perfect point source. It has a finite size.
Like the filament in a light bulb casting a fuzzy shadow.
Exactly. The further away the object casting the shadow, the collimator, is from the surface it falls on, the patient, the fuzzier the edge of the shadow the penumbra becomes. So if you can bring your final beam shaping aperture, the device defining the beam edge, physically closer to the patient's skin,
you minimize that geometric spreading, that fuzziness?
correct. You get a sharper geometric penumbra right where the beam enters. This is why specialized SRS cones often extend quite far down from the LINAC head, getting as close as safely possible to the patient.
Okay, minimize the collimator to patient distance. Makes sense. Anything else?
One more factor related to the machine design itself, a small source size. The actual spot on the target where the electrons hit to produce X-rays. The smaller that effective source size is, the sharper the geometric penumbra it can produce, all else being equal. This works hand in hand with close collimation.
Got it. So summarizing the gradient drivers, many intersecting beam arcs, often non-coplanar, using intermediate energy like 6 MV, getting the final collimator close to the patient, and having a machine with a small source size. That's the physics toolkit for building that dose cliff.
That's the essence of it, yes.
All right, now let's talk about how we actually deliver this using the machines we have. Standard medical linear accelerators, or LINACs, are often adapted for SRS SBRT, right? They're not all dedicated machines like Gamma Knife.
Correct. Many, probably most, SRS and SBRT treatments worldwide are delivered on standard LINACs that have been specially equipped and commissioned for these high-precision techniques.
So what are the key adaptations? What makes a standard LINAC SRS capable?
The main modifications usually involve the collimation system, how the beam is shaped, and integrating advanced image guidance, IGRT, and potentially motion management systems.
Okay, let's focus on collimation first. You mentioned cones earlier.
Yes, tertiary cones. These are add-on devices. Think of them as precisely machined metal cylinders or cones that attach to the treatment head below the standard jaws and MLCs. They define a circular beam shape.
Tertiary meaning they're a third layer of collimation.
Exactly. You have the primary collimator near the source, secondary collimators like the jaws and MLCs, and then these cones are added as a final tertiary shaping device. They come in various fixed diameters, typically quite small, maybe ranging from 4 millimeters up to 30 or 40 millimeters.
And they stick out close to the patient, like we discussed.
They do. They're designed to extend downwards, minimizing that collimator to patient distance. Because they're simple, rigid circular apertures positioned close to the patient, they generally provide the sharpest possible penumbra and dose gradient for a given field size on a LINAC.
Sounds ideal for small, round targets then.
Perfect for small, spherical lesions, yes. The main limitation, though, is their shape. They only produce circular fields.
What if your target isn't a perfect circle? What if it's irregular?
Then you can't conform the dose tightly with a single cone. The traditional approach with cones for irregular shapes is to use multiple isocenters. You'd essentially cover the irregular target by overlapping several smaller circular shots, each centered at a slightly different point, isocenter, and potentially using different cone sizes.
Sounds like that could get complicated and time-consuming. Planning multiple overlapping circles, delivering each one.
It can be. Planning can be complex, and delivery takes longer because you have to accurately set up and deliver each individual cone shot. So, while cones offer the sharpest edge, they lack flexibility for conformal shaping of complex targets in a single setup.
Okay, so what's the alternative on a LINAC for shaping dose tightly to irregular targets?
That's where micro-multi-leaf collimators, or MMLCs, come into play. These are specialized MLC systems designed specifically for stereotactic treatments.
What micro meaning?
Yeah.
Smaller leaves.
Exactly. Standard MLCs used for conventional IMRT might have leaf widths of, say, 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters when projected at the isocenter. MMLCs have much thinner leaves, typically projecting to 2.5 millimeters, 3 millimeters, maybe up to 5 millimeters at the isocenter.
So significantly finer resolution for shaping the beam.
Much finer. This allows the MMLC to conform the radiation field much more closely to complex, irregular target shapes, outlining the target boundary with greater precision than standard MLC.
And the big advantage of that is?
The big advantage is it enables highly conformal treatments, often using a single isocenter, even for irregularly shaped targets. You can use the MMLC to deliver static conformal fields, step-and-shoot IMRT, or even VMAT, tailored precisely to the target shape. This generally makes planning more intuitive and delivery much more efficient than using multiple cone isocenters.
How does the penumbra compare? Is it as sharp as with cones?
Generally, the penumbra from an MMLC is slightly wider than what you can achieve with a dedicated cone placed very close to the patient. This is partly because the MLC assembly is usually positioned a bit further away, and the leaf edges themselves might not be quite as sharp as a machine's circular aperture. Also, the edge is segmented by the leaves rather than being a smooth curve.
But still much sharper than a standard MLC.
Oh, absolutely. Significantly sharper than standard MLCs and perfectly adequate, clinically excellent for the vast majority of SRS and SBRT applications on a LINAC. You gain enormous flexibility in conformal shaping and efficiency, potentially at the cost of a very slightly wider penumbra compared to the absolute optimum with a cone.
Okay, so it's a trade-off. Cones give maybe the ultimate sharpness for perfect circles, but are inflexible, while MMLCs offer excellent sharpness with huge flexibility for irregular shapes and efficient single isocenter delivery.
That's a perfect summary of the LINAC collimation option.
Now, let's switch gears to keeping the patient still and knowing where the target is. Immobilization and localization. You said these are critical.
Absolutely paramount. You can have the best beam shaping in the world, but if the patient moves or you don't know exactly where the target is, the precision is lost. The approach differs a bit between SRS intracranial and SBRT extracranial.
Let's start with SRS in the brain. What's the classic approach?
The historical gold standard for SRS immobilization is the invasive stereotactic frame. This is typically a metal ring or frame that is physically attached to the patient's skull using pins or screws that penetrate the scalp and engage the outer table of the skull.
Oof, screws into the skull. Sounds intense for the patient.
It is, undeniably. It requires local anesthesia where the pins go in, and it's certainly not comfortable. But the advantage is absolute rigidity. The frame becomes rigidly fixed to the patient's skull, providing a stable platform.
And how does that help with targeting?
Once the frame is securely attached, the patient undergoes imaging, usually CT, sometimes MRI or angiography with the frame on. The frame has fiducial markers built into it that show up clearly on the images. These markers define a precise, three-dimensional coordinate system that is directly linked to the patient's anatomy via the rigid frame fixation. The treatment planning system uses this coordinate system, and the treatment machine is calibrated to understand and target based on these frame coordinates.
So the frame provides both rock-solid immobilization and a built-in targeting coordinate system.
Exactly. It's highly accurate and reliable. It's been the benchmark for SRS precision for decades.
But uncomfortable. Are there alternatives now?
Yes, increasingly common, especially for fractionated stereotactic treatments or when patient comfort is a major concern, are non-invasive frameless systems.
How do those work without the screws?
They typically rely on custom-molded thermoplastic masks. You take a sheet of plastic mesh, warm it so it becomes pliable, and then drape it over the patient's face and head, molding it precisely to their contour. As it cools, it becomes rigid, holding the head securely within the mask. These are often combined with bite blocks or dental molds that the patient bites onto, further restricting motion.
Okay, so a tight mask and maybe a bite block. Is that as rigid as a frame?
Generally, no. While modern masks can provide very good immobilization, they usually don't achieve the same level of absolute sub-millimeter rigidity as an invasive frame screwed to the bone. There can still be tiny residual movements within the mask.
So how do you maintain the required sub-millimeter accuracy with frameless systems?
This is where advanced image guidance, IGRT, and patient monitoring become absolutely essential. Frameless SRS heavily relies on these technologies to compensate for the slightly lesser rigidity.
What kind of IGRT?
Several techniques are used. One is surface tracking, where optical cameras monitor the patient's external skin surface in 3D in real time. The system compares the live surface position to a reference surface captured during simulation. If the patient moves beyond a very tight tolerance, like sub-millimeter, the system can automatically pause the radiation beam.
So constant monitoring of the outside of the head.
Yes, and also combined with frequent intrafraction imaging. This means taking X-ray images, like with cone beam CT or orthogonal KV imagers, during the treatment delivery, maybe between arcs or even during pauses in an arc, to directly visualize the internal target position relative to bony anatomy or implanted markers. If a shift is detected, adjustments can be made before continuing.
So frameless trades some absolute rigidity for comfort, but makes up for it with continuous monitoring and verification using imaging.
That's the core idea. It requires very robust IGRT protocols and technology to ensure that the sub-millimeter accuracy is maintained throughout the entire treatment fraction, not just at the initial setup.
Okay, that covers the head. What about SBRT for targets outside the brain, like in the lung, liver, or spine? Immobilization must be a different beast there.
It absolutely is. You can't screw a frame to someone's ribs. SBRT mobilization focuses more on reducing motion and providing a stable, reproducible setup rather than achieving the absolute rigidity of a head frame.
What kind of devices are used for body immobilization?
Common techniques include custom molded vacuum bags. These are like large bags filled with small styrofoam beads. The patient lies on the bag, air is sucked out, and the bag becomes rigid, conforming precisely to the patient's body shape. You might also use specialized body frames, often made of carbon fiber, that provide reference points and sometimes incorporate devices for abdominal compression.
Abdominal compression? Why compress the abdomen?
Primarily to limit respiratory motion, especially for tumors in the upper abdomen or lower lungs. Pushing gently on the abdomen restricts the diaphragm's movement, which can significantly reduce how much the tumor moves up and down as the patient breathes.
Managing breathing motion. That sounds like the major challenge for SBRT physics.
It is often the most complex physics problem to solve in SBRT. You have tumors, particularly in the thorax and abdomen, that can move significantly, sometimes centimeters, with respiration. Robust immobilization helps reduce this, but you can rarely eliminate it entirely.
So how do you deal with the remaining motion again? Lots of IGRT.
Absolutely critical. SBRT is heavily reliant on advanced IGRT techniques specifically designed for motion management. First, during the simulation phase, you almost always perform a four-dimensional 4D CT scan.
4D CT, what's the fourth dimension?
Time, essentially representing the breathing cycle. The 4D CT scanner acquires images while simultaneously recording the patient's respiratory pattern using an external marker or spirometer. The images are then sorted based on the phase of breathing, for example, peak inhale, mid-exhale, end exhale. This allows you to visualize the full trajectory of the tumor's movement throughout the breathing cycle.
Okay, so 4D CT tells you how the tumor moves. Then what do you do with that information during treatment?
You use it to implement a motion management strategy. There are a few main approaches. One is gating. Based on the 4D CT, you identify a specific, reproducible phase of the breathing cycle where the tumor is relatively stable, often at end exhale. During treatment, you monitor the patient's breathing in real time, and the radiation beam is only turned on when the patient's breathing enters that predefined gate or window. When they breathe outside that window, the beam turns off.
So you only treat during a small portion of the breathing cycle?
Correct. It ensures you're only irradiating when the tumor is reliably in the planned position. The downside is it can make treatment times longer because the beam is off much of the time.
What else besides gating?
Another major strategy is tracking. This typically requires implanting small, inert fiducial markers, like tiny gold seeds, in or very near the tumor before simulation. During treatment, specialized X-ray systems integrated with the LIDNAC track the position of these internal fiducials in near real time.
And what does the system do once it knows where the fiducials are?
It depends on the system. Some systems might use the tracking information to gate the beam, similar to respiratory gating, but based on internal anatomy. Other, more advanced systems, like the CyberKnife we'll discuss later, can actually use the real-time fiducial position to dynamically adjust the beam's aim to follow the tumor's movement.
Wow, so the beam actually chases the moving tumor.
In essence, yes. Or the robot holding the beam source adjusts its position. Other systems might track the tumor and adjust the patient's position using a robotic couch. The goal is continuous adaptation to the motion. You can also track bony anatomy for things like spine SBRT, or sometimes even attempt direct soft tissue tracking using advanced imaging, though that's often more challenging.
Okay, so for SBRT, the key physics steps for motion are characterize it thoroughly with 4D CT, then choose and implement a strategy like gating or real-time tracking, often using fiducials, to ensure the dose hits the moving target accurately.
Exactly. Managing motion is job number one for safe and effective SBRT in mobile sites.
This is incredibly complex. Which brings us to the physics of commissioning and quality assurance, QA. Given the tight tolerances and high doses, the QA must be unbelievably stringent, right?
It absolutely is. The physics QA for SRS SBRT systems is significantly more demanding and time-consuming than for conventional radiotherapy. Mistakes are just not an option.
What are the really critical physics QA tasks specific to these techniques?
There are several, but let's highlight a few key ones. First, isocenter accuracy verification. We talked about using multiple beams converging on the target. That convergence point, the isocenter, has to be incredibly well-defined and stable.
How accurate does it need to be?
The tolerance is typically less than or equal to 1 millimeter. You need to verify that the point in space where the radiation beam axis intersects, the point around which the gantry rotates, the point around which the couch rotates, and the center point defined by the imaging system all coincide to within 1 millimeter in 3D space.
1 millimeter total deviation across all those rotational axes and imaging systems?
Yeah.
That's tiny. How on earth do you measure that?
The gold standard procedure for this is the Winston-Lutz test.
Winston-Lutz. Sounds like a law firm.
Maybe it should be. It's a fundamental test. Conceptually, here's how it works. You place a small radiopic object, usually a precisely machined metal ball bearing, BB, or sphere, right at the intended machine isocenter, using the machine's lasers or positioning systems.
Okay, put a tiny metal ball exactly where you think the center is.
Then you set up a very small radiation field, using either an MMLC or a small cone aimed at the BB. You then acquire images, typically electronic portal images, EPDs, using the megavoltage beam, or KV images using onboard imagers of the BB positioned within that small radiation field.
Just one image.
Oh no, you take images at many different combinations of gantry angles, couch angles, and collimator angles. You might rotate the gantry all the way around, taking images every 30 or 45 degrees. Then you rotate the couch, repeat the gantry rotation, then rotate the collimator, and repeat again. You end up with a whole series of images showing the BB inside the radiation field from many different perspectives.
And what are you looking for in those images?
You analyze each image to determine the center of the radiation field and the center of the BB. Ideally, in a perfectly aligned machine, the center of the BB should be exactly superimposed on the center of the radiation field in every single image, regardless of the gantry, couch, or collimator angle.
So any difference between the BB center and the field center tells you there's a misalignment.
Precisely. You measure the displacement vector, how far and in what direction the BB is off-center for each image. By analyzing the pattern of these displacements across all the different angle combinations, you can determine the radius of the sphere encompassing all these deviations, essentially, the overall 3D accuracy of the machine's isocenter convergence. And that radius must be less than or equal to the tolerance, typically 1 millimeter.
Got it. Winston-Lutz use a BB and many images at different angles to map out the true convergence point and ensure it's within that 1 millimeter bubble. Crucial test. What's another major physics hurdle?
Arguably the most technically demanding and often frustrating physics task for SBRT commissioning and ongoing QA is small field dosimetry.
We touched on this needing special detectors. Why is measuring dose in tiny fields, say less than 3 by 3 centimeters squared or even smaller, so incredibly difficult?
It's a perfect storm of physics problems. The first major issue is the loss of lateral electronic equilibrium, LEE.
Lateral electronic equilibrium. Okay, break that down.
In a large radiation field, think about a tiny volume deep inside the tissue. Electrons are being knocked loose by photons within that volume. These electrons travel a bit, depositing dose. At the same time, electrons knocked loose outside that volume might scatter into it. In the center of a large field, the number of electrons scattering out of the tiny volume is balanced by the number scattering in from adjacent regions. That's equilibrium. This balance makes dose calculation and measurement relatively straightforward.
Okay, in equals out in large fields. What happens in small fields?
In a very small field, especially near the edges or even on the central axis if the field is small enough compared to the electron range, those electrons knocked loose inside the field can scatter out laterally across the field boundary before they deposit all their energy. But because the field is small, there aren't enough electrons being generated outside that boundary to scatter back in and replace them.
So you get a net loss of electrons and therefore dose within the field boundary.
Exactly. There's an underdosing effect, particularly near the field edges, due to this lack of lateral electronic equilibrium. Standard dose calculation algorithms and standard measurement assumptions often rely on LEE being present, so they can fail significantly in these small fields if not specifically designed or corrected for this effect.
Okay, loss of LEE is problem 1. What else makes small fields tough?
Problem 2 is detector volume averaging. Most detectors we use in radiation therapy have a finite sensitive volume where they measure the dose. Think of a standard farmer-type ionization chamber, maybe 0.6 cubic centimeters in volume, often cylindrical.
Relatively large compared to a 1 centimeter diameter SRS field.
Exactly. Now remember those steep dose gradients we need. In a small SRS field, the dose might be changing very rapidly across the physical dimensions of that farmer chamber. The chamber can't measure the dose at a specific point. It measures the average dose over its entire sensitive volume.
So it smooths out the dose profile.
It does. It averages the high dose in the center and the rapidly falling dose at the edges, effectively blurring the measured profile, and, importantly, often underestimating the true peak dose or output factor on the central axis compared to a larger reference field. The bigger the detector relative to the field size and the steeper the gradient, the worse this volume averaging effect becomes.
Okay, so your detector's too big to see the sharp details. Makes sense. Any other issues?
Yes. A third related issue is detector perturbations. The mere presence of the detector itself, its physical size, its density, the materials it's made of, plastic walls, metal electrodes, air cavity versus solid-state material, changes the radiation field compared to if it were just water or tissue. The detector perturbs the electron fluence.
It interferes with the measurement just by being there.
To some extent, yes. In large fields, these perturbations are often small or well-characterized. But in a small field, where the detector's volume might be a significant fraction of the irradiated volume, these perturbation effects can become much more pronounced and harder to correct for accurately. Different detector types perturb the field differently.
Wow. Loss of equilibrium, volume averaging, detector perturbations, no wonder it's hard. So the physics problem-solving step is clear. You absolutely cannot use standard large detectors. What do you use?
You need specialized detectors designed specifically for these challenging conditions. They generally have very small sensitive volumes and/or minimize perturbations. Key examples include
Silicon-based detectors, often with very small sensitive areas like 1 millimeter end of March. They need corrections for energy and dose rate dependence but offer high sensitivity. Unshielded is important because shielding used in some diodes for conventional dosimetry can cause issues in small fields.
These use natural or synthetic diamond crystals. Diamond is nearly tissue equivalent in density, minimizing perturbation. They offer excellent spatial resolution and dose rate independence, but can be expensive.
These are ion chambers, specifically engineered with tiny sensitive volumes, maybe down to 0.004 cubic centimeters or even smaller. They try to minimize volume averaging while retaining some characteristics of ion chambers.
This is film, like GEF chromic film, that changes color density upon irradiation, proportional to dose. It requires careful handling and calibration, but because you scan the film with high resolution, it provides excellent 2D spatial information and avoids volume averaging. It's often considered a gold standard for relative dosimetry, like profiles, though getting absolute dose can be.
Okay, so diodes, diamonds, microchambers, film, a whole different toolkit.
Absolutely. And using them correctly requires following specific protocols, like those outlined in reports like AAPM Task Group 155, PG 155. These reports provide detailed guidance on correction factors, measurement techniques, and cross-comparisons needed for accurate small field work.
And let's just hammer this home one more time for anyone listening, especially if boards are on the horizon. What detector is completely, utterly wrong for small field output measurements?
The standard farmer-type ionization chamber. If you see that as an option for measuring output factors in a 1 by 1 centimeter SRS field, it's the wrong answer. Way too much volume averaging. It's a classic pitfall.
Got it. Farmer chamber, bad for small fields. Now, what about the calculation algorithm in the treatment planning system, TPS? Does that need to be special too?
Yes, absolutely critical. The algorithm used to calculate the dose distribution needs to be accurate not just in water, but specifically accurate for small fields and also accurate in heterogeneous tissues. SRS SBRT targets are often near or involve interfaces between tissue, bone, and air, like in the lung or sinus.
Why are older algorithms problematic here?
Older, simpler algorithms, particularly pencil beam algorithms or similar simple convolution methods, often struggle significantly in these situations.
What's their weakness?
Pencil beam algorithms typically model the dose by, summing up the contributions of narrow pencil beams. They often make simplifying assumptions and don't accurately model the complex lateral transport of scattered photons and especially secondary electrons. This lateral scatter is precisely what becomes dominant and complicated in small fields and near-density interfaces where electronic equilibrium is lost.
So they fail to predict the dose accurately where LEE breaks down.
Exactly. They might overestimate dose in some areas and underestimate it in others, particularly near heterogeneity boundaries or at the sharp penumbra of small fields. The physics problem is that they use an oversimplified model of particle transport.
So what's the solution? What algorithms do work well?
You need more sophisticated algorithms that model the underlying physics more accurately. The two main classes suitable for SRS SBRT are Monte Carlo algorithms. These are generally considered the most accurate. They simulate the life history of millions or billions of individual radiation particles, photons, as they travel through the patient's CT anatomy, tracking each interaction based on fundamental physics probability. It's a direct simulation, so it naturally handles small fields and heterogeneity. The downside is it's very computationally intensive, though modern computing power has convolution superposition algorithms, sometimes called collapsed cone or AAA. These are approximations of They first calculate the distribution of primary photon interactions and then use pre-calculated kernels that describe how dose spreads out three-dimensionally from those interaction sites due to scattered. They explicitly model lateral transport much better than pencil beam algorithms. They are generally faster than Monte Carlo, but still highly accurate for most clinical SRS SBRT.
So the physics problem is inaccurate modeling of scatter. The solution step is using advanced algorithms like Monte Carlo or convolution superposition that handle it properly.
Correct. But even with these advanced algorithms, careful commissioning is crucial. You can't just turn them on and trust them. You need to perform extensive measurements in phantoms, including small fields, heterogeneous setups using those specialized detectors we just discussed, and meticulously compare the measured data to the algorithm's calculations. You have to validate that the algorithm, as implemented in your TPS, accurately predicts reality for the specific conditions you'll encounter in SRS SBRT.
Trust but verify, especially with complex calculations.
Always. And one more related point on calculations. The calculation grid size. When the TPS calculates the dose, it does so on a 3D grid superimposed on the patient's CT scan. To accurately represent those extremely steep dose gradients we need for SRS SBRT, that calculation grid needs to be very fine.
How?
Typically, you need a grid resolution of 2 millimeters or less. If you use a coarser grid, like 3 millimeters or 4 millimeter, which might be acceptable for a conventional RT, the calculation points will be too far apart to capture the sharpness of the dose fall-off. The algorithm will effectively average the dose between grid points, artificially smoothing out the steep gradient. This could lead you to misinterpret the plan, thinking the fall-off is gentler than it really is, or inaccurately assessing coverage and normal tissue dose.
So small grid size, 2 millimeter, is essential to even see the sharp gradients you're trying to create and evaluate.
Precisely. It's a critical detail for accurate planning.
Okay, so the QA picture is rigorous isocenter verification with Winston-Lutz, 1 millimeter, tackling the beast of small field dosimetry with specialized detectors and protocols, no pharma chambers, using and meticulously commissioning advanced calculation algorithms, Monte Carlo or con superposition, and ensuring a fine calculation grid to 2 millimeter. It's a whole different level of physics oversight.
It truly is. The precision demands it.
Now, let's talk about some of the dedicated machines or systems heavily optimized for this kind of work. The classic one is the Gamma knife.
Yes, the Lexel Gamma knife. The original dedicated SRS machine, specifically designed for treating targets within the brain.
What makes it unique? What's its core physics principle?
Its source is what really sets it apart. Instead of an electron beam hitting a target like an ELINAC, the Gamma knife contains approximately 200 individual cobalt-60 sources.
200 radioactive sources. Wow. Where are they?
They are arranged in a hemispherical array, precisely positioned within a heavily shielded central body or helmet structure within the machine.
Cobalt-60. That brings back some basic physics. Remind us about its properties.
Sure. Cobalt-60 is a radioactive isotope that decays primarily via beta emission, followed by the release of 2 high-energy gamma rays, with an average energy around 1.25 MeV. Critically, it has a half-life of 5.26 years.
Half-life of about 5 years.
Yeah.
That means the dose rate isn't constant, right?
Exactly. The activity of the sources, and therefore the dose rate delivered by the gamma knife unit, decreases continuously over time. It drops by roughly 1% per month. This is a major physics consideration. You absolutely must account for this decay when calculating treatment times. Treatment times for the same dose will gradually get longer as the sources age. Accurate decay correction is fundamental to gamma knife dosimetry.
Okay, so 200 decaying Co-60 sources. How does it focus all that radiation onto a small target?
Pure geometry. All 200 sources are meticulously aimed so that the narrow beams of gamma rays they emit converge precisely at a single point in space, the machine's focal point or isocenter.
So, massive cross-firing onto one spot. How is the beam shaped or collimated for different target sizes?
The patient is immobilized using that invasive stereotactic head frame we discussed earlier, providing rigid fixation and the coordinate system. During treatment, the patient's head, fixed in the frame, is docked to the Gamma Knife unit. A large collimator helmet is then placed over the patient's head, fitting precisely onto the frame.
A helmet with holes in it.
Essentially, yes. The helmet contains multiple channels or holes that align perfectly with the paths of the gamma rays coming from the 200 source. Different helmets are available, and within each helmet there are typically sectors that can be blocked, or more commonly now, the helmets themselves have fixed collimator channels of specific sizes built in. These define standard circular shot sizes, typically 4 mm, 8 mm, 14 mm, or 18 mm in diameter at the focal.
So you choose a helmet or shot size based on the target.
Yes. A Gamma Knife treatment usually involves positioning the target lesion, using the frame coordinates, exactly at the machine's isocenter and exposing it for a calculated amount of time using one of the available shot sizes. If the target is irregular or larger than the biggest shot size, you might deliver multiple overlapping shots, slightly shifting the patient's position between shots using the precise frame system, maybe using different shot sizes or durations for each position to paint the dose over the target.
Multiple overlapping circular beams from 200 converging sources. What does that do to the dose distribution?
It creates an extremely sharp dose fall-off outside the target volume. This incredibly rapid gradient is the hallmark of Gamma Knife. The massive convergence from so many sources, combined with the precise geometry and fixed collimation, results in a dose distribution that peaks intensely at the center and drops off very, very steeply just millimeters away.
And this sharp fall-off allows for that unique prescription method.
Exactly. Gamma Knife plans are traditionally prescribed to the 50% isodose line, 50% IDL.
50%, that sounds low.
It means the edge of the target volume, as defined by the planner, receives 100% of the prescribed dose. But that dose contour corresponds to the 50% line relative to the maximum dose. The implication is that the dose at the geometric center of the target, where all the beams converge maximally, is actually 200% of the prescribed dose.
Wow, a super hot spot in the middle. How is that safe?
It relies entirely on that extremely rapid dose fall-off just outside the 50% line. The philosophy is hit the target center with a very high dose, ensure the target edge gets the minimum required dose, the prescription dose at 50% IDL, and trust the incredibly steep gradient to protect the surrounding normal brain tissue from receiving damaging doses, even though the central dose is double the prescription.
Okay, so summarizing Gamma Knife physics.
Yeah.
200 decaying Co-60 sources, remember decay correction, converging beams, invasive frame immobilization, circular collimator helmets defining shot sizes for 8, 14, 18 millimeters typical, treatment via single or multiple shots, extremely sharp dose fall off, and the characteristic 50% IDL prescription.
That captures the key physics aspects perfectly. High accuracy, typically around 0.5 millimeter geometric precision, is also a hallmark due to the rigid frame and machine design.
All right, now let's talk about the other major dedicated system, or maybe a different philosophy, the CyberKnife.
Right, the Accuray CyberKnife system. It offers a very different approach. And while it can do intracranial SRS, it's particularly known for its versatility in extracranial SBRT, especially for targets that move.
How is it fundamentally different from Gamma Knife, or even a standard LINAC?
The core difference lies in its architecture. The radiation source is a compact, lightweight 6 MV linear accelerator, LINAC. But this is the key. This LINAC is mounted on a highly agile industrial robotic arm.
A LINAC on a robot, like in a car factory.
Very much like that. It's a sophisticated robotic manipulator with typically 6 degrees of freedom. This means it can move the LINAC head, and therefore the beam, almost anywhere around the patient and orient it along virtually any direction.
What does that robotic freedom allow?
2 major things. First, incredible flexibility in beam angles. It can deliver beams from potentially hundreds of unique nodes or positions around the patient, many of which are highly non-coplanar. Second, and crucially, it can deliver beams non-isocentrically.
Non-isocentric, meaning the beams don't all have to pass through a single central.
Correct. Unlike Gamma Knife or standard LINAC arcs that rotate around a fixed isocenter, the CyberKnife robot can move the source to different locations and aim beams along paths that don't necessarily intersect at one point. This gives planners enormous freedom to find beam angles that avoid critical structures while still covering the target.
Okay, a robot arm giving beam angle freedom. How does it shape the beam?
It primarily uses circular tertiary cones, similar in principle to the cones we discussed for LINACs. It has a set of fixed cones of various sizes, typically ranging from 5 millimeters up to maybe 60 millimeters, that mount onto the LINAC head.
So circular fields again, like cones on a standard LINAC or gamma knife shots.
Yes, in terms of basic beam shape, it uses circular fields. However, the most defining feature of the CyberKnife and its core physics innovation for solving clinical problems is its integrated image guidance and real-time tracking system.
Ah, we mentioned tracking earlier. How does CyberKnife do it?
It has two diagnostic kilovolt kV X-ray sources mounted, often in the floor or ceiling, and corresponding digital detectors. These are positioned orthogonally at 90 degrees to each other.
Like having two sets of eyes watching the patient from different angles.
Exactly. And these imagers acquire X-ray images frequently throughout the treatment delivery, maybe every 30 seconds, maybe every minute, sometimes even faster, depending on the target and tracking method.
And what are they looking at or tracking in those images?
Several things can be tracked. The most common is internal fiducials, those small gold markers implanted near the tumor. The system's software automatically identifies the 3D position of these fiducials on the orthogonal X-ray images. It can also track bony anatomy for targets near the spine or skull base. And there are methods for tracking the diaphragm or even using complex algorithms to correlate external markers with internal tumor position learned from the 4D CT. This is sometimes called synchrony.
Okay, so it's constantly checking the target's position using these live X-rays. What does it do with that position information? This is the crucial part, right?
This is the kicker. The system calculates the target's current position in 3D space based on the live images. It compares this to the planned target position. If it detects that the target has moved due to breathing, patient settling, etc., it sends correction signals directly to the robotic arm.
And the robots.
The robot dynamically adjusts the position and aiming of the LINAC in real time or near real time, usually updating between beam segments or nodes, to compensate for the detected movement. It keeps the radiation beam locked onto the moving target.
Wow. So instead of gating or just hoping the patient holds still, the CyberKnife robot actively chases the tumor's position.
That's the fundamental concept. It's designed to actively manage motion during delivery. This allows for potentially tighter planning margins, even for significantly mobile tumors in the lung, liver, pancreas, or prostate, because the system is continuously correcting for that motion.
So the concise physics summary for CyberKnife is compact 6MV LINAC on a flexible robotic arm, uses circular cones for collimation, but its defining feature is the integrated orthogonal kV X-ray imaging system, providing real-time or near real-time target tracking, which feeds back to the robot to dynamically adjust beam aiming and compensate for motion.
You nailed it. Robotic LINAC plus real-time X-ray tracking equals CyberKnife's core identity.
That really highlights the different philosophies. Gamma Knife's brute force precision through 200 converging beams and rigid fixation versus CyberKnife's dynamic precision through robotic agility and real-time tracking. And standard LINACs offering flexibility with cones or MMLCs, relying heavily on robust IGRT and motion management strategies like gating.
It's a great illustration of how different physics approaches can be used to achieve the same clinical goal of high-precision dose delivery.
So given these different platforms, standard LINACs with cones, LINACs with MMLCs, Gamma Knife, CyberKnife, how does a clinic or a physician choose which platform is best for a particular patient or situation? What are the deciding factors?
It's a complex decision, often based on a combination of clinical needs and physics capabilities. Key factors include:
is it intracranial, brain upper spine, or extracranial? Gamma Knife is primarily intracranial. LINACs and CyberKnife can treat both. Target size and shape. Small spherical targets might be ideal for cones, LINAC or CyberKnife, or Gamma Knife shots. Large, irregular targets often benefit from the conformal shaping capabilities of MMLCs on a LINAC.
Is the target static, like most brain lesions, or does it move significantly, like lung or liver? For highly mobile targets, systems with robust integrated motion management like CyberKnife's tracking or LINAC systems with advanced gating or tracking capabilities are often preferred. Number of targets. Treating multiple brain metastases might be very efficient on a Gamma Knife due to its design. Treating multiple body lesions might favor a flexible LINAC or CyberKnife approach. Available resources and expertise. What technology does the center actually have? And equally importantly, does the physics and clinical team have the specialized training and experience to safely and effectively use that technology for SRS, SBRT commissioning, and QA are demanding for all these systems?
Can you give us a quick suitability breakdown, like a cheat sheet, based on the physics we've discussed?
Sure, a rough guide might look like this.
Best suited for multiple small intracranial targets. Strengths are efficiency for multiple METs, extremely sharp fall-off ideal for brain tissue sparing, and the historical benchmark for frame-based rigidity, limited to brain upper C-spine. LINAC with cones offers potentially the absolute sharpest penumbra for small, spherical targets anywhere accessible by the LINAC. Can be less efficient for multiple or irregular shapes due to the need for multiple isocenters. Requires excellent IGRT motion management if used outside the brain. LINAC with MMLCS, the workhorse for conformal shaping of irregular targets virtually anywhere in the body. Highly flexible planning, single isocenter IMRTV mat, efficient delivery. Penumbra slightly wider than cones, but excellent. Frameless techniques are common, requiring strong IGRT. Excellent all-around flexibility.
Particularly strong for targets that move significantly, lung, liver, pancreas, prostate, due to its real-time tracking and robotic compensation. Non-isocentric capability offers unique beam angle flexibility, potentially sparing organs at risk better. Primarily uses circular cones, so shaping is based on combining circular fields.
That's a really helpful framework for thinking about platform selection based on the physics advantages and limitations. Now, we briefly mentioned radiobiology. What are the key take-homes about the biological effects of these high doses per fraction?
It's a huge area of research, but a few key points. First, as we said, the high dose per fraction, hypofractionation, likely overcomes the tumor's ability to repair sublethal damage between fractions, which is a major factor in conventional fractionation. This might make tumors that are traditionally considered radioresistant more sensitive.
Okay, less repair. What else?
There's evidence that these very high doses might engage different cell-killing mechanisms beyond just direct DNA damage. Things like inducing significant damage to the tumor's vasculature, essentially choking off its blood supply, or triggering specific molecular pathways like ceramide-mediated apoptosis seem to play a larger role at these high single doses compared to conventional 2-gene fraction.
So potentially hitting the tumor harder and through different biological pathways?
Potentially, yes. But the flip side, and the most critical point from a physics and safety perspective, is the impact on normal tissues. Because you're giving such a massive dose in one go, or just a few, the consequences of a geometric miss are drastically amplified.
Zero tolerance for error.
Essentially, yes. With conventional therapy, if you slightly miss the target on one day, the normal tissue often has time to repair, and the cumulative dose might still be acceptable. With SBRT, delivering 15 or 20 gray to the wrong spot, even just once, could cause severe, irreversible normal tissue toxicity, necrosis, nerve damage, paralysis, depending on the location. Conversely, slightly underdosing even a small part of the tumor margin due to a setup error could lead to marginal recurrence, where the tumor grows back right at the edge of the treated field.
So the physics precision isn't just about elegance, it's absolutely fundamental to the safety and success of the treatment because the biological stakes are so high.
Precisely. You need extreme confidence in your targeting accuracy.
And one quick clarification on RBE, relative biological effectiveness. We know protons have an RBE of about 1.1. Do these high-dose photons get a different RBE factor?
That's a great question and a point of occasional confusion. While biologically, a single large fraction of photons clearly has a different effect than many small fractions, that's the whole basis of dose-response models, like the linear quadratic model, the standard convention in clinical photon radiotherapy planning, including SRS and SBRT, is to assign photons an RBE equal to 1.0.
So even though the biology is different, for dose calculation and reporting, we still call it RBE equals 1.0.
Correct. The differences in biological effect due to fractionation are handled through radiobiological modeling, like calculating biological effective dose, BED, not by changing the fundamental RBE value used for photons in the planning system. So if for boards in practice, photon RBE equals 1.0, even for SRS SBRT.
Okay, RBE 1.0 for photons, always. This has been incredibly comprehensive. Let's try to synthesize this. If someone is listening, maybe cramming for boards or just trying to solidify their understanding, what are the absolute clinical pearls or must-remember physics points from everything we've covered?
Okay, let's try a rapid-fire summary, the board blitz essentials. 1. Core principles. High-dose fraction and noxious extreme precision, Slevin small PTV margins, and rapid dose fall-off, steep gradients. Know these four and how they link. 2. Gradient drivers. How do you get steep gradients? Many non-coplanar beam SARCs plus intermediate energy, 6MB, often best for sharpness, plus close collimation plus small source size. 3. LINAC collimation, cones, circular, sharpest penumbra, potentially multiple isocenters needed, versus MMLCs, these thinner leaves than standard MLCs, great conformal shaping for irregular targets, allows efficient single isocenter IMRTV mat. 4. Immobilization localization. SRS frame-based, rigid coordinates versus frameless. Mass by block needs strong IGRT surface tracking interfraction. SBRT, body mold bags compression plus critical motion management. 4D CT essential, then gating or real-time tracking fiducials bone. 5. Key QA test. Winston Lutz for ISO-center verification tolerance 1 mm. Know this test and how it works. BB at ISO-center, images at various angles. 6. Biggest physics challenge small field DOSI 3x3. Know why it's hard. Loss of LE, E, and volume averaged. Know which detectors are needed. Unshielded diodes, diamonds, microion chambers, film follow TG155. Know which detector is BAD, standard farmer chamber. 7. Calculation algorithm. Need advanced algorithms, Monte Carlo or convolutions. Pencil beam is generally inaccurate, must be carefully commissioned, needs small calculation group. 8. Gamma knife, intracranial SRS, 200, cobalt-60 sources, half-life 5.26 years of decay correction needed. Converging beams, frame-based. Collimator helmets, circular shots, 4, 8, 14, 18 mm. Traditional prescription, 50% IDL. Extremely sharp fall-off. 9. Cyberknife, robotic 6 MV LINAC. Uses circular cones. Defining feature. Real-time KV X-ray tracking, Futelsbone driving robotic compensation for motion, non-isocentric capable. Great for moving targets. Lung, liver.
Photon SRS SBRT uses RBE equals 1.0. Biological differences handled by fractionation models, BED. 11. Overarching Pearl. Extreme confidence in targeting is paramount due to potential for severe toxicity or marginal misrecurrence with high doses per fraction.
Fantastic summary. That hits all the high points we discussed. All right, feeling sharp. Ready to test that recall with a quick board blitz.
Let's see if the cache is still active, or if I'm about to experience that classic post-physics exam amnesia.
Yes. The phenomenon where you walk out of the exam room and suddenly can't remember Ohm's law, despite having derived Maxwell's equations an hour before.
Exactly. Or you can perfectly explain the intricacies of Bragg-Gray cavity theory, but have absolutely no recollection of where you parked your car. It's like the brain just hits delete on the physics folder to make space for, remembering how to tie your shoes.
Well, let's hope these SRS SBRT facts stick around a little longer. Question 1. For achieving the sharpest possible dose falloff, penumbra, when treating a small spherical target with LINAC-based SRS, which collimation method is generally superior. A. Micro multileaf collimator, MMLC, shaped conformally. B. Standard multileaf collimator, MLC, with narrow leaf width. C. Circular tertiary cones placed close to the patient. D. Dynamic conformal arcs using standard MLCs.
Thinking about proximity and aperture sharpness, I'm going with C. Circular tertiary cones placed close to the patient.
Correct. That close distance minimizes geometric penumbra for the ideal shape. Okay, question 2. A key feature distinguishing the CyberKnife system from standard LINAC-based SBRT is its integrated use of A. Cobalt-60 sources for steeper dose gradients. B. Micro multileaf collimators for superior conformality. C. Cone beam CT for pre-treatment setup verification. D. Real-time KV X-ray imaging and robotic compensation for target.
That defining feature has to be D. Real-time KV X-ray imaging and robotic compensation.
Absolutely right. That real-time feedback loop to the robot is its unique identifier. Question 3. A physicist is commissioning a LINAC for SRS using MMLCS. Which physics task presents the most significant challenge compared to commissioning for conventional radiotherapy? A. Measuring the PDD for large field sizes. B. Verifying the accuracy of the optical distance indicator, ODI. Performing the Winston-Lutz test to submillimeter accuracy. D. Accurately measuring beam output and profiles for field sizes less than 2 by 2 square centimeters.
The one that gives physicists nightmares. D. Small field dosimetry. That measurement accuracy challenge.
Exactly. Winston-Lutz is critical C, but small field dosimetry D is often considered the bigger hurdle technically. Final question number 4. The prescription isodose line typically used for gamma knife radiosurgery planning is A. 95%, B. 80%, C. 60%, D. 50%. I think it should be D. 50%, since we have sharp dose fall off.
Correct again. Remembering that implies the 200% hotspot in the center. You aced the blitz. The physics folder is clearly still intact. Phew. Maybe I can find my car keys after all.
Let's hope so. So to wrap up this really detailed session, we've journeyed through the core principles of SRS and SBRT, that interplay of high dose per fraction, the absolute need for extreme precision, which then allows for those small PTV margins, all demanding that rapid dose fall off.
Yeah, and we explored the physics tools used to carve out those steep gradients, the clever use of multiple, often non-coplanar beams or arcs, the somewhat counterintuitive choice of intermediate energies like 6 MB to manage electron scatter, the importance of getting collimators physically close to the patient, and the role of the machine's inherent source size.
We contrasted the LINAC approaches, using those ultra-sharp circular cones, ideal for spheres but potentially cumbersome for irregular shapes, versus the flexibility of micro-multileaf collimators, MMLCs, that allow elegant conformal shaping for complex targets using efficient single isocenter techniques like IMRT or VMAT.
And we really hammered home the critical nature of quality assurance. The sub-millimeter precision demanded by the Winston-Lutz test for isocenter verification, and especially the significant multifaceted challenges of small field dosimetry, understanding why it's hard, LEE, volume averaging, perturbations, and knowing you need specialized detectors like diodes, diamonds, microchambers, or film, and definitely not a standard farmer chamber, plus the need for advanced, well-commissioned calculation algorithms and fine grids.
Then we looked at the dedicated platforms, the Gamma knife. Its iconic 200 cobalt-60 sources converging on a single point, the reliance on invasive frames and collimator helmets for circular shots, its unique 50% IDL prescription strategy built on that incredibly sharp falloff, and that crucial need to track and correct for cobalt-60 decay over time.
And contrasted that with the CyberKnife, the agile robotic arm carrying a 6MV LINAC using circular cones, but defined by its integrated KV X-ray imaging that tracks the target in real time, or near real time, and directs the robot to compensate for motion, making it a powerful tool, especially for mobile tumors in the body, leveraging that non-isocentric capability.
We touched on how choosing the right platform involves weighing factors like location, size, shape, and motion against the physics strengths of each system. And we briefly covered the radiobiology, the potential for different kill mechanisms with high doses, but emphasizing the absolute intolerance for targeting errors due to the severe consequences, while remembering the photon RBE remains 1.0 for planning.
It really underscores how these advanced techniques are built upon a deep understanding and a meticulous application of fundamental physics principles, pushed to the limits of precision. The physics isn't just background, it's the enabling factor and the safety check.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on. We're seeing AI and machine learning creep into almost every aspect of medicine. Thinking about SRS and SBRT, where could these technologies make the biggest impact? Could AI refine real-time motion tracking beyond current fiducial or surrogate methods? Could it automate the complex corrections needed for small field dosimetry, or perhaps even discover entirely new beam angle optimization strategies and planning systems to create even steeper gradients or spare organs at risk more effectively than humans can? Where's the next leap in precision going to come from?
It's definitely an exciting time. The technology and techniques are always evolving.
Indeed. You can find detailed notes from today's discussion and join the conversation on our website, radoncsmartlearn.com. Let me spell that out. RADONCSMARTLEARN.com. radoncsmartlearn.com. Please subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss our future sessions. Next time, we're planning to shift gears and start exploring the equally fascinating physics of electron beam therapy and planning.
Thanks so much for tuning in and digging into this with us.